Coming up on Philosophy Talk.
How have the past 12 months challenged our assumptions and made us think about things in new ways?
I'm kind of an optimist about people.
The year in democracy without elections?
People randomly chosen would realize that they could do something that might really help address some of the underlying problems that their community faces.
There's a Goldilocks problem here.
The year in powerful people getting away with it.
On the one hand, I don't want prosecutors who are too timid. On the other hand, I don't want prosecutors who are overly aggressive and overly opportunistic. There's a sweet spot in the middle.
What's with all the politics? Didn't anything cool happen in philosophy this year?
There's a lot of loose talk regarding intelligence, consciousness, and philosophers can be guides to some conceptual clarity about what's really happening.
It's the examined year 2024.
Because the unexamined year is not worth reviewing.
Coming up on Philosophy Talk.
Hey, philosopher. Just taking a moment to thank you for being a listener.
And asking you to please consider an end-of-year gift to support the program so that we can continue to question everything.
Except your intelligence. This year, it's been everything from Marx and morality to mind-sharing to Mayan mythology.
So head over to philosophytalk.org and click Support Us at the top of the page.
Or give the gift of thought to another philosopher in your life with a subscription to our library of more than 600 episodes.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for thinking.
And thank you for supporting Philosophy Talk.
What's the deal with powerful people getting away with it?
Could the key to saving democracy be moving beyond elections?
Did anything cool happen in philosophy this year?
Welcome to Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything.
Except your intelligence. I'm Ray Briggs.
And I'm Josh Landy. We're coming to you via the studios of KALW San Francisco Bay Area.
Continuing conversations that begin at Philosopher's Corner on the Stanford campus, where Josh teaches philosophy.
And at the University of Chicago, where Ray teaches philosophy.
Today, it's the examined year 2024, our annual look back at the ideas and events that shaped the last 12 months.
Because the unexamined year is not worth reviewing.
So, I hear there was an election this year?
Yeah, I heard about that too, Ray. How did it turn out?
No comment.
Anyway, last December, you and I were talking about what the results of this election could mean for our nation. As Ben Franklin memorably said, the United States is a republic if you can keep it. But what if the way to keep it isn't representative democracy?
Later in the program, we'll talk to Alex Guerrero from Rutgers University about his new book, Lottocracy, Democracy Without Elections. He's got some fascinating ideas about how to avoid political corruption.
Another takeaway from November's election is the end of court cases targeting the former president. And he's far from the only powerful person this year to avoid the consequences of alleged misdeeds.
Which is why we'll also be talking to Elie Honig, author of Untouchable, Why Powerful People Get Away With It. We'll ask him why it's so hard to prosecute rich and powerful people, and why it's recently gotten even harder.
But looking beyond politics, there have been some bright spots this year.
Yeah, things have been really cooking in philosophy. In just a bit, we'll hear about some of those bright spots from Justin Weinberg, creator and editor of the Daily Nous, that's Nous, the leading online source for philosophy news.
But first, let's hear from Ian Scholes, the 60-second philosopher. He's going to help us remember Ben Manila, the original producer of Philosophy Talk, who sadly left us earlier this year.
Ian Scholes, popping into this look at what the past year brought us and what it took away, to note that superstar radio producer Ben Manila passed away in September. He was the guy who took the idea of two philosophy professors from Stanford University, John Perry and Ken Taylor, and helped it become the public radio powerhouse the world calls Philosophy Talk. Took a while to gel, but a new kind of talk show eventually made its home on KALW, where the subtleties of existentialism could do war with Socrates, Marxism do battle with John Locke, and nary a drop of blood be shed, not even during a pledge drive. I suspect Ben was responsible for non-host elements of the show, namely the roving philosophical report, which he called Where the Rubber Meets the Road, showing how the topic or philosopher or school of thought for the day had an impact in this, our real world. And also for the addition of me to the mix as a kind of Andy Rooney, I guess, a button at the end, an after-dinner cocktail, as it were, a bit of teen appeal, if you will. I would never question Ben Manila's judgment when it comes to radio. It was his calling. As a teen, he was a wrestling champion, but declined an athletic scholarship at NYU and instead went into drama and ended up, of course, being a campus disc jockey. From there, he hit the ground running in the 1970s as a producer for News Blimps, an alternative radio news service. He came on board as production director and DJ at WLIR, the feisty radio station that made its mark by introducing new wave music to America. He made his own mark in NYC, producing his own features and documentaries before relocating to San Francisco in the 1990s. Ben Manila Productions made itself known for the next 20 years. The House of Blues Radio Hour, later renamed the Bluesmobile, a longtime feature with Dan Aykroyd hosting as Elwood Blues. In 2003, Martin Scorsese and the Experience Music Project helped lead a nationwide multimedia event, the Year of the Blues. This included Ben Manila Productions' 13-hour radio documentary, The Blues with Keb Mo, the most widely distributed special in the history of public radio. There were other projects as well, the Loose Leaf Book Company, about children's authors with Tom Bodett, and historical series like Inside the National Recording Registry with the Library of Congress. Along the way, he took on a job teaching journalism from a radio perspective at UC Berkeley, and of course, Philosophy Talk. The year before his passing was spent shepherding the Bluesmobile to the archives of the Library of Congress, all the shows, and the entire catalog of raw interviews with most of the great blues players of our time. He was an innovator, an archiver, broadcaster, an all-around radio guy. Marconi said, in the new era, thought itself will be transmitted by radio. Well, we're getting close. The thoughts on Philosophy Talk are transmitted via the miracle of radio. Radio never dies. Check out Ben's obituary on legacy.com. Dozens of people came by to pay their respects, most of them people who still remember him fondly from when he was a disc jockey in New York 40 years ago. And we remember him here, right now. I gotta go.
Thanks so much, Ian, and thanks to Ben for taking John and Ken's idea for philosophy on the radio and turning it into something people wanted to listen to.
Thanks to the three of them, we're still here, 2 decades later, talking about philosophy. Thinking of which, what were the philosophy highlights of 2024?
For that, we turn to Justin Weinberg, professor of philosophy at the University of South Carolina. He's also creator and editor of the philosophy news site, the Daily Nous. For Justin, the good news starts with the increased profile of public philosophy.
One of the National Book Award finalists in the nonfiction category was authored by a philosopher, Kate Mann. Her book, Unshrinking, on fat phobia. It made it all the way to the shortlist, and that was pretty exciting.
She's had some big accolades before, too. Her book, Down Girl, I believe, was a New York Times bestseller several years ago.
She's very talented at bringing philosophy at a pretty high level to a lot of people. I think it's a combination of her writing style, which sometimes brings together the personal and the philosophical. Also, a good choice of topics that seem really of interest to lots of people.
Tell us about more things that are happening and getting recognition in public philosophy.
Well, earlier in the year, the BBC came out with a list of new generation thinkers. They do this every year. It's just 10 people they picked from the entire UK, and 2 of them were philosophers, Jack Symes of Durham University and Jonathan Eggett of King's College London. That was pretty cool. And then just last month, Vox, a pretty popular online magazine, published its Future Perfect 50 list. It's a list of 50 people whose ideas and works seem to be particularly influential or important for our future. And 4 of those 50 were philosophers. Jonathan Birch at the London School of Economics, who's done work on consciousness, T. Nguyen at the University of Utah, who's done all sorts of interesting stuff on games and metrics and scoring, Jeff Sebo at New York University has done a lot of work on animal welfare, animal minds, and Shannon Valor at University of Edinburgh, who works a lot on AI technology, technology and the virtues, moral navigation of this future world of ours.
We've had some of those folks on the show. We had Tina Nguyen talking about games. We've had Kate Mann on the show. This is a very exciting moment for philosophy. Can you tell us why you think it's happening? Why is public philosophy having a bit of a moment right now?
Well, I think with the rise of the internet, philosophy has had a real significant role, and it's just been growing and growing and growing. So if you look at early on the philosophy blogosphere, people doing philosophy in an informal online context with others, that's been active since the late 90s. You've had people on YouTube developing various philosophical shows. There are at least 100 philosophy podcasts that I'm aware of. I'm not sure it's a brand new thing, having all this public philosophy, but it does seem like a kind of golden age for philosophy. People who are interested in philosophy can find it online. That's one of the advantages of our highly segmented media culture. People can produce lots of things, and there seems to be an audience for it. Perhaps philosophy is just an opportunity to take a break from some other elements of our culture and reflect a little bit, and maybe the difference of that from our usual lives is what's appealing.
Also, several of the authors you mentioned are dealing with really practical issues that I think do speak to personal lives. Like Jeff Sebo's work on animal rights, for instance, is, every person has probably interacted with at least one animal. A lot of us have eaten animals, whether that's good or bad. So I like the idea of escape, but I also think that there's like a kind of real practical relevance to philosophy.
You're probably right to note that. I think a lot of the changes that we're seeing in society with technology, with communication, raise philosophical problems that people are aware of. Also, social developments, exposure to new people, new ways of life is something that has not stopped happening despite our globalized world. And lots of dilemmas and problems. People are worried about AI. People are worried about various political issues. People are worried about the election. And there is a fair amount of philosophy that speaks to all of those things and more.
What have philosophers been saying in 2024 about LLMs, large language models, and artificial intelligence more generally?
I think one role that philosophers can have here is just clarifying what's going on. Way back in 2020, there was a nice little group article at my website, Daily Nous, by a bunch of people on the early versions of GPT-3 way back then. And there's a lot of loose talk regarding intelligence, regarding consciousness, and with understanding how LLMs tend to work and other forms of generative AI tend to work. It gives an impression that might be misleading, I think. And so philosophers can be guides to some conceptual clarity here about what's really happening.
So another thing that strikes me about LLMs is how people are using them for all sorts of things, both in publishing and in the philosophy classroom, where you might think they're not appropriate or questionably appropriate.
Yes, I think education is one of the domains that's significantly impacted by the development of LLMs. There's been some studies recently that suggest that professors are, for the most part, not detecting when LLMs are being used, and to some extent, sometimes even preferring the work that's produced by LLMs. Students want to know why they should be putting in the effort to write and to study when they can just ask a computer to do the work for them. And if we say, well, if you do that, you're not going to learn how to do this stuff, they might follow with, well, why will I ever need to do this kind of stuff?
I mean, that does seem to be the most urgent thing for us educators with regard to artificial intelligence, depriving yourself of the opportunity to train your brain, which is what these exercises that we set are all about. We're not really as interested in a particular theory about Plato's Republic as we are in the exercise of coming to grips with a really interesting text and figuring it out for yourself. And that's good for you. That's good for a person. But how do we get that across in an age of such ease of access of these new tools?
I wish I had an answer to that question. Sometimes I'm just amazed that students are doing any work at all. I mean, I don't have a magic bullet for convincing students that self-cultivation, self-development, the exercise of their skills is great for them. I think we have to maybe come up with something more inspiring, and maybe that will change how we teach.
Speaking of education, philosophy in public high schools is a thing that you published some blog posts on in 2024. Can you tell us what's happening with philosophy in high schools?
Sure, that's a great question. When students come out of high school and go to college, they'll have heard of English, they'll have heard of math, they'll have heard of physics, and then some things which they might not have done in high school, like maybe engineering or computer science or journalism. They know enough about what those things are that they're familiar. But philosophy, it's kind of not obvious at all what philosophy is. And so what this means is that many students might be shying away from taking philosophy classes out of an unawareness of what philosophy has to offer. Offering students philosophy in high school can be a way of getting them familiar with some of the richness and appeal of philosophy to help them take more philosophy in college. That's good for them, also good for philosophy departments at many places, which face increased threats of budget cuts, program cuts, and things like that.
Yeah, and I think I can say this since I'm technically not in a philosophy department, I mean comparative literature, doing a major in philosophy turns out to be measurably beneficial for undergrads, as far as I understand. Is that something that you've learned more about this year in 2024?
Well, yes. Philosophy departments have long advertised things like, if you take philosophy classes or major in philosophy, you'll do well on the GREs for graduate school, or the LSATs for law school, or the GMATs even for business school, all these standardized tests, or you'll become a better critical thinker. And we're confident in this because we love philosophy, we do philosophy, and we see its effects close up. But nonetheless, there's a rejoinder, which is, how do we know that philosophy is actually having those effects? It's that it's not just correlation, or that people who are naturally good with this stuff are then choosing to do philosophy because they like it, because they're good at it.
So just to clarify, there's prior data on this before 2024 that says philosophy students tend to do well at these things, but then you don't know why that is and if the philosophy is what's helping.
Yes. And so what's nice about what's happening over the last year or two has been an increased attention to trying to make the empirical case for these claims about philosophy. There was a little study done at the end of last year that suggested that the evidence is kind of indeterminate. And those two philosophers who worked on that, Michael Prinzing at Baylor and Michael Vasquez at UNC, they found that though there are still some selection effects, there is at least some modest difference and generally more growth in areas such as open-mindedness, curiosity, intellectual rigor, reflectiveness from students in philosophy classes than non-philosophy students.
Justin, what are you looking forward to in 2025 in the world of philosophy?
I think the answer is just the continuation of certain kinds of trends. So one is an increased welcomeness towards non-traditional forms of philosophy. And non-traditional forms of philosophy is kind of a broad tent that speaks to things that can have more practical application, for example, or philosophy that's done from the perspectives of people that are traditionally underrepresented in philosophy. Different approaches to philosophy. It would just be a remarkable coincidence if the best way to do philosophy was happened upon during, the last 50 to 70 years or so. Like that we'd be so lucky. Like we were the ones who figured it out, how to do philosophy the best. Given that seems just so unlikely, I think epistemically it's responsible for us to just be more welcoming to a greater variety of approaches. And the more we're welcoming to that and to the welcoming of different kinds of people having opportunities to do philosophy, I think philosophy will continue to improve, be more interesting.
Well, here's to a great year in philosophy in 2025. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's been a great talk.
Justin Weinberg, creator and editor of the philosophy news site The Daily Nous, that's Nous, telling us about the year in philosophy.
You're listening to Philosophy Talk, and we're taking a look back at events and ideas that shaped the last 12 months. It's the examined year 2024.
Coming up, is it just former presidents who avoid consequences for their actions? Or does America have a bigger problem with powerful people getting away with it?
It's the year in unjust desserts, when Philosophy Talk continues. Welcome back to Philosophy Talk. It's the examined year 2024. I'm Josh Landy.
And I'm Ray Briggs. We're taking a philosophical look at some of the big ideas and events of the past 12 months.
Because the unexamined year is not worth reviewing.
It's hard to look back on 2024 without talking about the U.S. legal system. The former president was found liable in a civil case this year, but he avoided facing any real consequences for the other charges against him.
Yeah, we like to say no one is above the law in the United States, but how true is that in reality? What happens if the Supreme Court seems to be kind of on your side? What happens if you can afford a team of lawyers smart enough to exploit every loophole and delay cases essentially indefinitely?
Elie Honig is executive director of the Rutgers Institute for Secure Communities. He is also a senior legal analyst at CNN and the author of Untouchable: How Powerful People Get Away with It. We asked him why it seems harder to prosecute powerful people.
Bosses naturally have insulation around them, right? If you take the example of a mob boss, which I went up against a lot of times their sole involvement in a crime was just a quick word, a quick sentence. Yeah, do it. Yup. Approving, that kind of thing. And it's really hard to prove that. You're not going to have physical evidence like you would at the scene of a crime. You're not going to have DNA. You're not going to have bullets and shell casings. You're not going to have fingerprints. You're not going to have audio recordings for the most part. So powerful people, and that goes for the mob, or it goes for powerful politicians or CEOs, they are insulated. We all know that smart, powerful people can pay for these sort of legal dream teams, quote unquote, although I don't always think they're so effective. But what real savvy bosses do is they will pay for lawyers for the people around them to prevent those people from flipping on them. There have been changes in the law over the years which have narrowed the scope of certain laws that we can use to prosecute people. I'll give you one example. There have been way fewer federal public corruption prosecutions over the last 10 years or so because of a series of Supreme Court cases, non-ideological, by the way, unanimous Supreme Court decisions crossing liberal and conservative lines that have steadily narrowed the scope of what counts as bribery, what counts as federal extortion, what counts under other corruption laws. So there's a whole bunch of factors, but the point that I try to make in the book is that it's a lot easier said than done, and there could be instances where you just know someone had to be involved, but knowing it and proving it as a prosecutor, being able to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, are often two different things.
Yeah, I mean, so Snyder versus United States is a quite shocking decision, at least to an outsider like me, that came out this year, where basically you can bribe someone as long as you pay them after they help you. And that, what? So you have these new legal decisions. You've got DOJ rules. You've got jurisdiction rules. You've got statutes of limitation. You've got evidentiary rules. What's the first thing you would change about this system if you had the power to do so?
I guess it depends who we're focused on. There are definitely things that can be done differently if we're talking about going after powerful politicians and presidents in particular, right? The presidents are, whether Donald Trump or others, are protected by all sorts of special rules. For example, DOJ has long had a policy in place going back to Watergate 1973 saying we do not believe we are constitutionally permitted to prosecute, try, and imprison the sitting president. Now, by the way, I think that's correct, just as a practical matter. I mean, let's be realistic. We're not going to have a system where the commander-in-chief is on criminal trial or behind bars. But that is one rule that, if changed, would make it far easier. Look, we just got the immunity ruling from the Supreme Court in July of this year, which didn't quite say the president can do anything he wants and get away with it. It's sort of glibly described that way sometimes, but that's not really accurate. What it did do, though, was set very broad protections for anything a president would do that is either a core constitutional duty, so vetoes and appointments and that kind of thing, or a peripheral constitutional duty, more on the outskirts of the presidential job. It was not a surprise to me that the Supreme Court recognized some form of criminal immunity. What was a surprise was the breadth of the decision. And this was in a Trump case. And they drew the parameters, A, very broadly, but B, very vaguely as well. So presidents have a lot of coverage. And I think with respect to people beyond presidents, I think the Supreme Court has been overly solicitous of them. I mean, you mentioned that recent bribery case. There was another case about a decade ago involving the former governor of Virginia, where the Supreme Court basically said if a public official takes outright gifts or bribes, it doesn't count as bribery unless there's a quote-unquote official act on the other end. And things like giving access and setting up meetings and making recommendations to policymakers, they don't count. So that really sort of opens the gates to any type of conduct that I think normal people would consider to be corrupt.
Yeah, and that's even before you get to potential malfeasance by certain defendants, like, for example, intimidation of juries or intimidation of witnesses. And that's not even getting into things like systemic bias, which is another thing you talk about in your book, where some defendants get treated differently from other defendants. How do you think about differential treatment within the U.S. justice system? That some folks who made concerted efforts to undermine a democratic election never really saw consequences, whereas this case recently, a poor person who merely tried to vote thinking she was eligible, paid a very high price.
So the key concept here is prosecutorial discretion. And one thing that people may not realize is prosecutors are not robots, and we're not supposed to be robots. It's not supposed to be as simple as conduct equals crime, hence we charge. you have to have conduct that you can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that does satisfy the specific statutory legal elements of the crime. But that's a starting point. If you don't have that, you're done, obviously. But once you have that, then you have to ask the sort of softer questions about the periphery. Is this fair? Is it necessary? Is it a good use of our resources? Is there better ways we could be spending our time and our money? Do we need to make a public deterrence point here or not? And I think when we entrust an awful lot to the individual judgment of prosecutors. And yes, there are guardrails in place. Prosecutors are always going to have some sort of internal vetting and approval system. But I think back to when I started as a prosecutor. I was 29 years old, so 20 years ago. And it gives me a little bit of a nervous chill because I know that at the time I did not have the maturity and judgment and experience to make these life-altering decisions for others. I mean, again, I had very good chiefs and colleagues, so I was reined in. But there were decisions that I made in those first few years that I would have made differently, usually on the side of leniency, as I got older and more experienced. And later in my career, when I was hiring young prosecutors, by this point I'm in my low 40s, let's say, and I'm hiring 27-year-olds, 28-year-olds, and it was terrifying. I mean, the one thing I was looking for when these young men and women came in and sat down, is this a decent person with decent judgment, or is this some sort of Yahoo cowboy who's going to want to rack up convictions just for their own ego or their resume or whatever? So one thing that I think people may not understand about our system is we really entrust a lot to the individual human judgment of our prosecutors.
Do other countries do this similarly? Like, one way to think about how to do it better and maybe resolve some of the biases, if that's even possible, is to look outside the US. Do you think there are lessons we can take from doing that?
So to some extent, I mean, on the question of bringing our most powerful people to accountability, a lot of other countries have done that successfully. You know, one of the fears or prognostications around these prosecutions of Donald Trump is, well, they would bring the country to its knees. They would cause chaos or disorder. If you look at other countries, Israel, Sweden, Scotland, South Africa, I'm blanking on some, I'm sure, Italy, France, have all prosecuted prime ministers, former prime ministers, or, the equivalent, and have been just fine, have not descended into chaos or disruption. So, look, the Trump cases, as you alluded to before, never ended up getting off the ground. I think there's a lot of blame to go around for that. I have been very critical of the state-level prosecutions brought by Alvin Bragg, who I should say is a friend and former colleague of mine. He was a federal prosecutor with me, but he's the elected Democratic DA of Manhattan, which is overwhelmingly Democratic. Whoever wins the primary there is going to become the DA. And Fani Willis in Georgia, same thing, elected Democratic DA in a heavily blue area. And I think when you have elected partisan prosecutors, or maybe to an extent judges, all of your self-interested incentives are to pile on a charge against an unpopular figure of the other party. And I actually think that was part of the overkill in the prosecutions of Donald Trump. And I think that ended up redounding to his benefit. They piled on charges that had already been brought by the feds. There was no reason for Fani Willis to pile on, except that she made herself famous. She gave herself 100% name recognition, and she badly undermined the effort to bring Donald Trump to accountability.
You're listening to Philosophy Talk. It's the examined year 2024, and we're talking to Elie Honig, author of Untouchable: How Powerful People Get Away with It.
Let's broaden things out slightly here. Your book talks about a certain former and future president, but also talks about the Harvey Weinstein case. Cyrus Vance declined to prosecute. You also talk about Jeffrey Epstein, where Alexander Acosta made this deal where all he got was low-level state charges and no federal charges. So you've put before us a large number of situations where somebody who's rich and or famous and or powerful seems to get away either with not much prosecution or no prosecution. What do you see as the consequences for society of having a legal system that seems so vulnerable like this?
Yeah, the Jeffrey Epstein case, the Harvey Weinstein case, the Bill Cosby case, all three of those cases follow a sort of similar arc, which is this. When the cases first came to the attention of the respective prosecutors, they all backed off. All of them had makeable cases. I mean, Jeffrey Epstein was dead to rights. They had Harvey Weinstein on tape saying to a woman who wore a wire, essentially, oh, I do this. I grope women all the time. I usually get away with it. Bill Cosby, they had all sorts of victims. And in each of those cases, the first thing was to basically give them a pass, either an altogether pass or a ridiculously lenient plea deal. Then phase 2 is these cases come back into public prominence, either because journalism sometimes, in the Epstein case, we had a very good journalist down in Florida who sort of blew the cover off this case, Julie Brown, or because the person rises to prominence. The Jeffrey Epstein prosecutor, Alexander Acosta, then became Donald Trump's, one of his cabinet nominees in his first term. And then when that happens, there's sort of a public uproar. And then what you see is the prosecutors doubling back and saying, actually, we're going to reopen this. Actually, we're going to take a new look at this. Actually, we have some new evidence. And then bringing charges, which lead to sort of a mixed bag of results. I mean, Jeffrey Epstein ultimately was facing very serious charges from the Southern District of New York when he died in prison, when he killed himself in prison. But both Bill Cosby and Harvey Weinstein had their cases ultimately thrown out. Harvey Weinstein, one of multiple cases, so he's not out of prison, but Bill Cosby is out of prison now, but thrown out by courts of appeals because prosecutors, each one was a separate story, but because of essentially prosecutorial misconduct, because prosecutors went back on prior promises they had made and overreached. So maybe there's a commonality here, as I say it out loud, with Fani Willis and with Alvin Bragg, which is when prosecutors see a big target, a glitzy name target, their eyes get big and their judgment perhaps gets a bit compromised. And so that's a phenomenon that we've seen, put aside Donald Trump, time and again when it comes to famous, rich, powerful people.
Okay, so prosecutorial misconduct is part of it. That makes perfect sense. But you also talk in the book about a number of ways in which life is just difficult for prosecutors. So one example you give is evidentiary rules. So it's not allowed to bring in large amounts of information about a defendant's prior crimes, even in the same area as the crime that's being charged. Now, there's that famous line, I think it's William Blackstone, it's better that 10 guilty persons escape than that one innocent suffer. And that's why the system is designed the way it is. It's designed to give a fair and perhaps even more than fair opportunity for a defendant to mount their own defense. But has it gone too far in that direction? Has it made it almost impossible to bring certain high-profile defendants to justice?
When you talk about the rules of evidence, I haven't thought about this in a long time, but when I was selecting a jury one time in one of my criminal cases, we had a potential juror, and each one would be sort of interviewed by the judge and the parties briefly. And one of the standard questions is, would you be able to put faith in the evidence as you see it presented to you here in the courtroom? And this juror, out of nowhere, said something to the effect of, no, not really, because I understand that what happens here in the courtroom is not actual truth. It is a highly filtered form of truth. And we all sort of had our jaws on the floor, like, wow, that's exactly right. We have rules of evidence. It's not a free-for-all. It's not the way you could argue something with your family at the holidays or on talk radio where anything goes and let the good arguments prevail and let the irrelevant or inflammatory arguments be disregarded. Instead, we highly curate what facts, what evidence can be shown to a jury. Now, there's very good reasons for that. We're trying to protect, the liberty interests of the person who stands to be separated from his or her family and locked up. But one of those rules that you alluded to limits the amount of what we would call other bad acts information. So Harvey Weinstein's a good example of that. Harvey Weinstein was charged with 3 separate, essentially, sexual assaults. But what prosecutors did is they tried to prove those 3 sexual assaults plus 6 or 7 others that were uncharged. And the judge reviewed them all and said, well, those are all fine too because they go to a larger plan and his MO, his modus operandi. And the appeals court ultimately said that was too much. That was a pile-on, that was prejudicial to Harvey Weinstein, and you went too far in what other acts evidence. And by the way, there's a reason for that. There's a self-interested reason for that. If you're a judge and you're thinking, well, I need to protect my record for appeal here, you're much safer ruling on the defendant's side than on the prosecutor's side. So yes, the rules of evidence do impact all of this.
But is there nothing you'd be militating to change about the way that the U.S. justice system is currently structured that does seem to make it, yes, of course, prosecutors often make mistakes, but even leaving that aside, the system does seem to make it, I don't know, a little bit easier than it should be for high-profile malefactors to get away with things.
A lot of what I argue in the book is it just comes down to prosecutors doing the case, first of all, fearlessly. I mean, a big part of the reason that some of those other cases we talked about, Epstein and Weinstein and Bill Cosby, were originally given soft passes was, frankly, the prosecutors were just intimidated. I mean, I found a quote from one of the prosecutors who was in the office that originally gave Jeffrey Epstein a pass, and she was urging the state's attorney at the time, Alexandra Acosta, to bring more serious charges. And she wrote, ultimately, she said, I think he just didn't have the spine. I think he didn't want to take on this super aggressive dream team of lawyers that Jeffrey Epstein had put together. It was Alan Dershowitz and Kenneth Starr and all these big name defense lawyers. And if you look at Cy Vance, the Manhattan DA, who A, declined to charge Harvey Weinstein, and B, declined to bring charges against Ivanka and Donald Trump Jr., way back years before Donald Trump became president, I think he just didn't have the guts for it. I think he was, it was reported, and I repeat it in my book, that he was taking donations from the Trump family, that he gave them favorable treatment after he met with Donald Trump's lawyer, who had been a big donor to him. So prosecutors, a lot of this is on prosecutors. Prosecutors have to do their jobs fearlessly. Prosecutors can't back down from there's a Goldilocks problem here, right? I guess on the one hand, I don't want prosecutors who are too timid. On the other hand, I don't want prosecutors who are overly aggressive and overly opportunistic, as we talked about earlier. There's a sweet spot in the middle.
Well, Elie, I really hope that things are going to start going a little better in the world of the justice system in the U.S. Thanks so much for the fantastic book, and thanks so much for talking with us today.
Thank you both. It was a pleasure. Appreciate it.
Elie Honig, senior analyst at CNN and author of Untouchable, How Powerful People Get Away with It.
You're listening to Philosophy Talk. It's the examined year 2024, our annual look at events and ideas that shaped the last 12 months.
Coming up, after the fraught election we've just endured, is it worth thinking about a new paradigm for collective decision-making?
It's the year in democracy without elections, when Philosophy Talk continues.
Welcome back. I'm Ray Briggs, and this is Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything.
Except your intelligence. I'm Josh Landy, and we are taking a philosophical look at the past 12 months. It's the examined year 2024.
So, regardless of who they voted for, Americans generally think that representative democracy is important. You know, they think we should elect people to represent our views, and those representatives should enact policies. But how important are elections really when it comes to running a democracy?
Alex Guerrero is professor of philosophy at Rutgers University and author of the brand new book, Lottocracy, Democracy Without Elections. We asked him what's so bad about representative democracy.
One big problem, I think, we want to all see the political institutions as helping us work together to solve urgent problems that we face and that we face together. But I think more and more elections, rather than helping us in that way, have actually put us at each other's throats and created division and discord where none need exist. So concentrating our attention on the things that most divide us rather than on issues where we might find more common cause, and also making it so that we don't trust each other, and also we don't think well of each other. So we vilify the people on the other side, and we basically see ourselves as in mortal danger on each side of being oppressed and dominated by the other side every 2 or 4 years, depending on how the election goes. And I think that's no way to live. So that's a big central concern that animates my thinking, well, maybe we should consider something other than elections.
So I agree that this is a big problem, but then the natural next question is, well, what's the alternative? We don't want kings and queens ruling us, so what should we do?
I think one of the difficulties has been getting past the kind of Churchillian shrug, this famous Winston Churchill quote that it's the worst form of government except for all the others. And I think that really works with us on a deep level. One of the things I try to argue for in the book and elsewhere is that we should take seriously the history of democracy really was one that began with use of sortition, use of lottery selection of political representatives. And election was sort of seen as a way of having a kind of oligarchic structure. And that really drops out in the 18th and 19th century in particular. And now we think of democracy as tied to elections, but lottery selection of people to serve as political representatives is an old component of democracy. And I think there's many ways of incorporating randomly selected people that really might make things better.
Right. In ancient Athens, that's how they selected their magistrates. They were chosen by lot. And it's super interesting to think that that's a possibility. And clearly it worked okay. But how well would it work here? Would every single elected position, member of Congress, governor, president, would every position be chosen by lottery rather than by election?
Well, there's many different ways, right, of doing this. You bringing randomly selected people into political life. Right now, all around the world, there have been citizens' assemblies used for a wide variety of things, reforming election law, thinking about, constitutional reform in Iceland and Ireland, thinking about climate change in France. The way those bodies have worked, randomly selected people have been brought together to focus on one particular issue. And their role has been usually to come up with an idea or a proposal, but then that proposal gets turned over to other people. So in particular, it might get turned over to a legislature that's been elected and they could think about it, or it might get turned over to a direct referendum of citizens voting directly on the proposal as crafted by these randomly selected citizens. So I like elements of that, but I think it doesn't go far enough. One worry is that I think with elections, we bring in a lot of background ignorance. People don't know enough about the particular issues. They haven't had a chance to study or learn about them. It makes it easy for people to be manipulated, for kind of media capture and elite influence to really drive the outcomes. And so what I argue for is a kind of broad systemic reform, which would remove something like a central generalist legislature and replace it with a network of something like 20 different single-issue legislative bodies, each one selected randomly throughout, the political community. People might come to serve on these bodies. And so part of the question is, how would the random selection work? And another big issue is sort of how would this single-issue focus and legislative structure work? But I think that model promises both to do better by way of performance and to do well by general considerations of things like equality and participation and responsiveness.
People kind of vary in what they know anything about and what they care about. So these single issue legislatures, do you put your name in to sort of be potentially selected on an issue that you know and care about, or is just everybody up for election? How does the pool of people get chosen?
So, one of the fun things thinking about this is there's so many choice points. So one option would be for people to, of the 20 different areas, you might care a lot about housing and education and agriculture, let's say. And so then you might put your name in and be in the pool of people who might be chosen to work on those areas. Now that would make it so that the people chosen might be more likely to be knowledgeable and invested, but it also brings along the worry about skew in terms of who might be putting their names in those particular hats. And so the version of it that I argue for would have true random selection across the population for each of these categories. And so then the natural question, how would people know enough about these issues? And that's where a core part of the system is really this learning phase and deliberation phase that would also be part of the process if you've been randomly selected to serve on one of these bodies. And so I think a lot of the details there are going to matter in terms of affecting how well individuals who might know nothing about the topic can actually perform in these roles.
So I like this idea quite a bit. I imagine that the people selected would be pretty representative of the population. That's good. They wouldn't be presumably quite as susceptible to the vast amounts of money in the political system that go into these election campaigns. That's good. They didn't run for office. That's good. It sort of reminds me of Plato's Republic. The last person you want in office is someone who wanted it. But what do you say about how long it takes? Isn't one advantage of the current system that someone can be in the office for quite some time, and that gives them the opportunity to get up to speed on a lot of different topics so that they're competent to respond when situations arise? How can we approximate that under your system?
Yes, well, that's one of the reasons I think a key alteration of the system is that rather than being selected to serve on a generalist legislature where you'd need to learn about every policy domain or potentially vote on things in every policy domain, instead you'd only be responsible for one topic. And that, I think, combined with people serving, say, 3-year terms, and also having it structured so that if there are 450 people serving in the agriculture single issue legislature, 150 new people would come each year. So you'd have some people who would have a year or two of experience already under their belt. And so that, narrowing of the domain of policy combined with several years in the role, I think would enable people to become substantially well informed. Now, one of the things that I think would be vital, and this is true for any policy issue in the modern world, everything is highly complicated, very hard to know what would make for a good legislative, enactment or policy reform. So I think we're going to need to rely on experts, and that's where the learning phase, the structure of the learning phase, people would be brought in as experts or advocates or stakeholders to provide background and context and arguments about what we ought to do with respect to topics within this domain. Also, it's always a comparative question with the elected representatives, many of whom spend almost no time actually learning about any of these issues in any detail. I think what we see in elected legislatures is a lot of policymaking by special interests who essentially write the legislation, lobby powerfully for people who are in elected office to do what they want policy-wise, and then they sell it back to us, the general public, as something that'll be good for us. But in fact, it's been largely written and designed by the people who stand to benefit the most economically, from the very top in terms of getting this legislation or getting this policy or this regulation in place.
So I agree with you about the problems of elected representatives often not knowing enough and just caving to special interest lobbyists. But why would we think that selecting people by a lottery would improve things at all? So, elected officials, they worked to be there. How do you get people to take their lottery-selected position seriously?
Yeah, it's one of the things, sometimes talking to people about this, it becomes clear I'm kind of an optimist about people. I think people generally do care about these issues and they care about their community. In many of these cases, people randomly chosen would, I think, realize that they could do something that might really help address some of the underlying problems that their community faces. And I think looking at citizens' assemblies, the people participating overwhelmingly do a really remarkable job paying attention, being involved in the discussions, taking the job seriously. If they see that these are institutions given some substantial power and actually able to do things that would make the lives of people they care about better. Furthermore, you could really do a lot to reduce corruption and undue influence of various kinds. So you could pay people well for their service, but then condition that payment on them not taking outside money from special interests. They don't have to run for re-election, so they don't have those kind of perverse incentives influencing their decision-making, and they can think in a kind of more pure way about what would actually be good for people like them from their community.
Okay, so I'm not quite as much of an optimist, but I wonder whether in specifically the United States context, this is actually a great idea because, if you think about both systems, that is to say the current system and your proposed system, as having strengths and weaknesses, and it being really a comparison between the two, in the United States, it's kind of a catastrophe, right? The Electoral College systematically disadvantages one party for the presidency. Same with allocation of senators. In the House, there's rampant gerrymandering. Everything is awash in oligarch dollars, thanks to Citizens United. So a lottery-based system surely is better than that. Does that generalize to other OECD countries, or is the United States really a special case, right, where, boy, the democracy in this country has some significant flaws that you really don't find to the same degree in other democracies?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think when we evaluate and assess political institutions and think about whether they'd be good, we always, I think, have to bring in the context. Where would it be good? Would it be good here? Would it be good there? And those are separate inquiries that require us to think about, well, what are the particular problems that are being encountered in these different places? So I by no means think that lottocratic systems are some kind of silver bullet needed everywhere to address every kind of problem. I think there's a lot of places in which they wouldn't be a good idea because people don't trust the political actors to run something like a fair lottery, and they would be maybe quite reasonably suspicious that it wouldn't be a genuine fair lottery. I think there's other places where maybe elections are working just fine, perhaps places with less background socioeconomic inequality, maybe places where there's less incentive for people to try to capture the political institutions. So a lot of the policy and regulation that gets set, say, in the United States has a huge effect on various corporate interests. They care a lot about what U.S. law and U.S. policy is. They might care a lot less about some other jurisdiction where it makes less pressure then on those institutions in terms of lobbying and attempts to capture. They might also do better by public financing of campaigns, by general public education, making it so genuinely anybody could run from any community. And so all of those things could be better and different in other places, making it sort of less urgent to switch to something as radical as this.
Well, Alex, I have to say, you've kind of talked me around. Count me in. Not only do I want this system, but I want to be chosen. I want to get on one of these committees. Thanks so much for joining us today.
No, my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
It's coming through a hole in the air.
Alex Guerrero from Rutgers University, author of Lottocracy, Democracy Without Elections.
You can listen to extended versions of all of today's conversations at our website, philosophytalk.org. And while you're there, you can also become a subscriber and examine 21 years of philosophy talk in our library with more than 600 episodes.
Ashes of the gay. Democracy is coming to the USA.
Philosophy Talk is a presentation of KALW San Francisco Bay Area and the trustees of Leland Stanford Junior University. Copyright 2024.
Our executive producer is James Cass. The senior producer is Devin Strolovich. Laura McGuire is the director of research.
Thanks also to Pedro Jimenez, Merle Kessler, and Angela Johnston.
Support for Philosophy Talk comes from various groups at Stanford University and from the members of KALW Local Public Radio San Francisco, where our program originates.
The views expressed
Or misexpressed
on this program do not necessarily represent the opinions of Stanford University or of our other funders.
not even when they're true and reasonable. The conversation continues on our website, philosophytalk.org, where you can become a subscriber and question everything in our library of more than 600 episodes. I'm Josh Landy,
And I'm Ray Briggs. Thank you for listening.
and thank you for thinking.